Capitalists trade money, communists trade people. It is historically acknowledged as normal for the communist governments to not peacefully transfer power, but to hang on to it as desperately as humanly possible. And this consistent arrangement does include, but is not limited to, the white supremacists in the Confederacy. These Confederate insurgent terrorists have actively been a part of the United States, infusing systemic racism in all of their particulars. The United States, having defeated the Confederacy, was a silly little femboy when dealing with the Confederates and actively sought to reabsorb them and all of their particular injuries to the United States, which by definition has catastrophically generated liabilities towards these United States and its particular potentials, systemically removing all of their protections under the United States obligations as a government to defend the civilians and their rights, and the active non defense of the civilian population put at it the secret society's potential threats to the United States civilian population in the conspiracy against rights, and the non defense is a conspiracy against rights, as gross negligence is criminal intention, and thus the infusing of the actual function of the Confederacy and those still a part of the Union originally actively maintains the function of the wizards and their communism. Now, the centralized wizard communism generates the pretense of their control over the particular populations. And this arrangement, trading people such as, I don't know, human slaves, generates the pretense of false arguments in order to generate human slaves, including but not limited to the function of poisoning them and saying that the alterations by the poison gives them a patentable product, allowing them to trade living things such as the human beings. This allows the functional trading of human lives in the slave trade organizations against constitutional authority, which is the enemy of their particular power. This generates these fraudulent pretenses, which exponentially compound on each other for the systemic racism and its fraudulent arguments. These arrangements of the centralized planned economy, actively infused by a fake democracy of wizard cultists, generates the pretense of centralized planned economies and statuses and other particular outcomes, which are a subversion of the rights in the United States law, which generates the position of its attack against all rights, including the right of liberty, self determination, freedom of movement, freedom of economy, and other essential functions in a free society, which, by definition, would become arbitrarily away from the central planned degeneracy, which has actively extorted the primary powers by the use of theft, such as the use of theft of the IPs owed to those in the free market by the patent houses and the non payment of the rightful owner to the patents was stolen to the white supremacists for the communist arrangement, and these exponential calculations require the restoration of David Bull's and the entirety of his faculties to calculate in its entirety concerning the correction against the insurrection in favor of the free market, which by definition is a thing that the United States Congress in the secret courts have actively engaged in ordering David to do, which is not David's responsibility unless they hired him for the position of the intelligence oversight as the top ranked general, which is a prerequisite concerning their ability to leverage his extraordinary wealth from the contract schedule, which is being obstructed by the communists. At which point, the restoration of the rule of law is the acknowledgement of the contract schedule and its profits, is the obligation of the Congress to have acknowledged those requests in the proper filings of the paperwork for the systemic correction back into the free market. At which point, David, having been characterized under those pretenses, has by definition become a legal character, which generates the assumption of the motive of their crimes on the basis of their acknowledgments and their retaliation against the acknowledgments, including the defamations, as the amount of positive qualities in a particular area would have generated retaliations to create as many negatives as positives, not just to bring him to neutral, but to make him the exact opposite. If he would have been a value plus 10 in a subject, he would then become a value negative 10 in that subject, generating the correction by the communists in their defamation and injury by war against the civilian population as an insurrectionist organization without service of law, which disavows themselves from the connection of the authority of the offices of the United States government, which makes them a terrorist organization. And this function in its entirety generates the pretense of the obligation to correct back into David's market, which fundamentally requires the in-depth study of those obstructions for a more perfect estimate. Now, these responsibilities requires the pretense of David conducting himself for the investment into high-grade status, which requires him to ensure more essential functions of the broader market, at which point his primary cash influx would then be transferred into the function of the purchase of a bonus credit score, making him more important as the network interest of protecting them with the coverage of replacement products and the zombie insurance, which requires the pretense of highly invested bonds, which generates the full defense of those mechanisms of the obstructed market or the potential to be obstructed market generates the ability to have covered them, which automatically allows the bonds to trigger for the funding of the restoration of the original product as you do in an insurance market, which by definition, according to their assumption that David, according to the contract schedule, will become the savior of Europe, would be a standard operating procedure in all of his treaties, such as his treaty with the United States, which is an economic treaty and a military treaty, and all other essential insurance treaties, which generates the pretense of the ability to defend their markets, and in the stability of that society generates the overarching interest of the mutual exchanged services in favor of the international order, which revolves around David. The observation of the investigation demonstrates the obstructed markets, which can only be applied to the ones that would have generated the agreement to join to the insurance from David, which are the only ones who could be protected. Otherwise, they would be considered vulnerable to themselves by having not conducted necessary planning in order to have defended against the injury, which generates the larger pretense of their misfortune, putting them into a larger category, which could only indirectly be observed by Congress as a general order of defense, which would require the Act of David to become intelligence oversight for the reporting to Congress over those particulars, with the active guidance of Congress ordering the specific policies seeking the protection of the general market, which requires them to have been interested in it in the first place outside of the generic campaign promises, which historically have been less reliable than one might hope or desire. Most of those orders, properties, values, and arrangements, by definition, have the highest potential classification clearance, as all of David's operations would have to be secret from the Wizard Communists, who, by definition, having actively infiltrated the United States government and others, would have actively compromised if they had access to the intelligence, and thus those most commonly investigated must not have access to the due diligence in order for the job to be conducted as equitably as would be desired by those who would consider it a service worth hiring. In the words of Kupka, a realm without a ruler, an army, even a people, a variable kingdom of dust. This is the natural erasure by the compromising of the intelligence to those most prone towards the white supremacy, and its generation of communism, such as the hired contract terrorists in order to enforce the central planned objectives, such as the Pinkertons or the progress of the intelligence operations, which has generated illegitimate oppositions to functions of the economy which had historically been observed as essential to the economy by those paying for it, at which point they, having broken up legitimate businesses, have then converted them in the transfer to the central planned owners, similar to the fascists, where they choose who is supposed to be in control over those companies, which generates an artificial structure of society which allows for the stabilized alternative society, which stabilizes the alternative government from the secret societies most prone to threaten the public security. Actively engaging in a violent tussle with David and the other pro Americans in this battle over the soul of these nations and their byproduct civilian populations, as all treaty holding nation is actively threatened by their existence. The treaties from David are based upon the realm obstructed by this illegal civil war, neutralizing David's kingdom, and thus it is a realm without a ruler. And that functional position has systemically conducted the extortions and delays requiring the systemic restoration of the education and work contracts, which would take an exponential period of time at any of the times, at which point the objective is to maximize the suffering and the disadvantages of David and the Americans or anyone competently trying to use any of those services. At which point the communists for the white supremacists under the Confederate States would generate the largest fighting retreat mechanism by their criminal censorships and obstructions for systemic sedition. And this realm without an army would not have the capability of opposing them, as the intelligence oversight in Congress and the judiciary does not have a mechanism of forcing the executive into compliance when it is non-compliant, and thus the mechanism of their usurpation of systemically ignoring the legal checks and balances from the government generates a parallel government loyal to the white supremacist communism. And in this, we all understand there is the destruction of the people in the systemic genocide, as David, as a social patriarchy, generates an entire people, and the erasure of their people and their culture is genocide. It is a malicious mass destruction of the entirety of that population. A veritable kingdom of dust. The Fey-wild pretense concerning the secret operations of David in his opposition to the Wizard Communism generates the position that was already highly non-observable into the mechanism of complete non-existence being plowed from the aggressive opposition. Consider for a moment the pretense of being able to do archaeological work in order to discover a historical feature. If the opposition in the fight is a genocidal construct, then they would actively level the entirety of those cities to complete level or the complete eradication of all of their support structures, destroying basements and anything under the ground as well, salting the fields, such as Rome against Carthage, preventing the possibility of conducting viable um, social operations or community agreements inside the area, as it is a complete extermination. And these extermination squads would rewrite history under William Barr's aggressive pretense that the winner gets to write the history, and thus the rewrite of history includes their changes by their operations to have polluted the record in order for them to determine what is or is not reality in their war against reality and reality's God. The treason, sedition, and high crimes of obstructions includes but is not limited to the act of the Confederate terrorists having access to the information, such as the double agents in Congress who, being loyal to the Confederacy, are actively at war with the United States, which they, having immediate access to the information, understand that David is the intelligence oversight general and that all the abuses against him are a criminal act of sedition, which makes each and every one of their decisions for the delay an act of sedition or a high crime. And thus, the position that they want to continue the criminal delays is the admission that they are a felon, unqualified to be in the office, at which point their active opposition to the legitimacy of the United States government is to instigate their removal as they are an active public threat from that confession, at which point they, knowing better, have a responsibility of releasing the information and enforcing or ordering the enforcement of the correction, such as, but it's not limited to, the duel, which generates the pretense of David returning to the intelligence oversight function with the restoration of his faculties to conduct the reports essential to national security, including its most immediate required function. And in that position, you understand that people and relationships are actively going to be need to be maintained. Functional and business unit reviews, organization and culture, and finally strategy would actively be the immediate expectations of David as he would be organizing those faculties and the restoration of that mechanism, and the assumption being from the high paid value of David that he would actively be worth the position, meaning by definition he would be staying on site doing more aggressive functions in the work than many of the staff, keeping the positive balance in play, which would actively encourage the location to have been David's DC mansion, according to the projection, which is essential to understand that the higher levels of the staff would actively be incorporating it as the headquarters, as the function of the obligation of the aggressive work would require a waking up to going to bed type routine until the schedule can level off more efficiently, demonstrating to the general staff that they are not expected to perform more than their superiors, allowing them to fall in line under the correct and competent leadership by their normal examinations and expectations. The position of gross negligence is common to the strategy of plausible deniability, which is a primary strategy of the white supremacists to cover for their phantom selves and their dog whistles, which generates the pretense of the obligation to oppose them on the grounds of gross negligence, as the outsider position of collateral damage is primarily the target under the theory that the best way to shoot the president the best way to shoot the vice president is to put them next to the president, and thus the cover of a more viable target creates the security for the mission, which would then be maliciously implemented. At which point, the strategies of these arrangements of removing the security from David's systems allows for the damages in the quote unquote collateral damages, which allows for the original intent, which required the dismantlement of the security, such as, but is not limited to, David's control over the Palestinian territories. Under the original contract schedule, the Palestinian areas would have been subordinated to David as a consulate state with Israel, which he would have been able to generate through the various faculties um, to have taken over the majority vote, forming the Republic state. At which point, the arrangement of those prosperities would allow for the renegotiation under those agreements, which would actively reinforce the foundation of the alternative to the war on terror structure, which would have been primarily more defensive, forcing the proxy war to engage on the basis of uh, fighting more indirect targets as opposed to the functional list of the illegal wars desired by the white supremacists in order to defend the petrodollar, which would have been replaced by the Confederate debt dollar, which is more sustainable as the function of the liabilities owed generically consumed in favor or subordinate to the United States or its allies under various uh, particular coalitions which would be allowed to be formed would generate a more sustainable mechanism as a functional currency, which would have stopped the pretenses of the retaliation of using um, something other besides the petrodollar in order to buy the oil, which would have changed the functional strategies of who to target, such as Gaddafi, who, being maliciously attacked on the basis of seeking to change the petrodollar um, into his own interests, was then targeted by the war effort, as the white supremacists viewed them as a fundamental threat to their hegemony, which they pretended was American hegemony, which they attacked David in order to destabilize the American hegemony, allowing them to capture it, making these primary subjects of security and insecurity, strategic vulnerabilities, the primary contests between David and the white supremacists. And without those conflicts, the progress would have been conducted, allowing for the security of those positions, which would have exponentially increased Israel's security far beyond the short that they took, which is something along the lines of 800 billion, uh, once or many times over, which would have generated a security, which is less viable as they are still being um, undermined in their security, which would not have originally been viable, making those positions quite the injury in reality, as the function is in practice um, Smedley Butler's war as a racket, which makes the act of money laundering from the exchanges of having conducted the mass investment into war functions from the military industrial educational complex and others to be able to push the money from politicians and others around, at which point everyone receiving their payoff then are predisposed towards the particular solution which pays the most into their pockets and to the reinvestment into their ability to become re-elected, which is not originally viable, as David, as the aristocracy, would be the one primarily in control over that, uh, most vehemently over the Senate, but the Congress as a whole would, by definition, be subordinated to that function, at which point David being in control by the basis of those investments would have substantially changed the entire dynamics of the mechanism, which was unsustainable to the white supremacists who believed that they were going to get choked up by the more viable service, which they would not be able to keep up with or sustain themselves off of the profits by comparison, as their inferior structures derive by their bigot tax, which is not a liability that David would be subordinated to. It is very important for the algorithm that we make it abundantly clear that it is, in fact, by definition, according to the theory of who, to destroy the United States and the world by the creation of the Antichrist. And the Antichrist, um, by definition, is a small horn that pushes out three larger horns, who creates a great miracle as coming back from the dead. And the foundational pretense of their targeting of David is on their claim of that function, which is founded on this reality that David's kingdom is a realm without a ruler, an army, or even a people, a veritable kingdom of dust. This is functionally, legally, practically manufactured reality. It is objective truth. Now, that system is their active position that the prophecies are not by accident. They are all on purpose. They are all the intellectual manipulations of the wicked who seek these established precedents for their monopolies, for their communist centralized superiorities and false legitimacies, which is the foundation of their society of perdition. And these positions of actively compromising their targets in order to compel them to comply with this system is founded on that active mechanism, which requires the criminal surveillance system, such as the nerve hacking, such as their active biological tampering, as the Antichrist being resurrected as though from dead for his kingdom. The horn is a kingdom, becomes, by definition, 3.5 years of peace and restoration amongst extreme injury and chaos, which is them doing it correctly. But then that target becomes overpowered by the spirit of Antichrist. Their ability to conduct this surveillance nerve hacking to overpower the person by the mechanism of their secret science is the mechanism of creating the Antichrist by the Wizards of Light. And that functionally has to be understood in context. The Wizards of Light worship Lucifer, the priesthood of Lucifer, the monks of Satan actively maintain that veritable religious compulsion mandatory against everyone else after the kingdom itself has proven itself more viable than any other could comprehend, was then to be extorted into a scam by virtue of its vulnerability to an outside malicious entity. The spirit of Babylon, similar to the functional worship in alignment in the support of Jezebel, which was condemned inside Revelation, as the church actively had this vulnerability that they tolerate that woman Jezebel, which is the functional same position, which is the active collective function of their malice towards the sexuality. So their attack and manipulation of sexuality is a foundational quality which is inherently important to understand that the Antichrist is not supposed to be attracted to women sexually. It is actively manipulated. The church in Revelation to be condemned is a supporter of the genital manipulations and the sorceries and the defrauding of the government, and it actively partners with the satanic rituals in these massive delusions, which facilitates their alter egos, allowing them to make themselves like gods in order to assert their veritable controls, have to conduct these mechanisms as a social norm, and in that reality would, by their very definition, have rejected all forms of sound doctrine, closing up their ears in favor of whatever would tickle them and throwing out anyone who is incapable of tickling their ears. The worship of Belial, of lawlessness, of chaos, the functional rejection of the Word of God in favor of whatever they particular seem interested in as would validate themselves, is one of the primary mechanisms of proof of the last days by virtue of tracking its defined church in Revelation. You need to understand that Laodicea is a church which is lukewarm. And Jesus says that he wishes that you are either hot or cold. But since you are lukewarm, I will spew you out of my mouth. This pretense towards their value is the direct acknowledgement that while they're acknowledged as a church, many or most as a collective spiritual identity, the spirit of that church has allowed many of them, by virtue of its culture, to be damned by virtue of these criminal acceptances, and the alignment with them is a suicidal act as a collective thing. And the fact that they are a church, going to church doesn't make you a Christian, and the function acknowledgement that they are a church. It is accepted that they are a church. They have an angel of their church. They are going in mass to hell with very few exceptions. They will be held under a great delusion, and they will be given to the Antichrist to seize them and to make war against them, and they will be subject. And many of them will be killed, and many of them will go to prison, and they will be abused, and they will be harassed, and they will be collected as they have taken the agreement from Balaam to have accepted the mingling with the things of God and the things of Satan. The story of Balaam and the donkey prophesying its position into the modern day as the primary strategy of them who are in the modern day are to collect as many to hell as they could possibly gather, manufacturing this in its entirety. And when the prophet Balaam was pursued by the enemies of Israel, he conceded to them for the money to trick Israel into condemning themselves by the rejection of God, by sleeping with the women and the worship of their idols.